So I churned up a whole lot of interesting conversation in the build-up to today's shir, just by the way, because I've been asking the question, do you feel that this life is a waiting room for the next life? So people say, no, it's not a waiting room, it's a working room. Okay, it doesn't change it. The question essentially I'm asking is, are we living for now or are we living for some point in the future? And this is a share in two parts because it's two Mishnayos that are both on the same theme. So we'll be doing this, please God, this week and next week. Right now we're in chapter 4 and it's Mishnah 16, Mishnah Tez Zayin. It's a short Mishnah and it's on exactly this theme. And that's why I said it was interesting the way things panned out this morning, because what happened this morning, due to the time confusion or whatever the case is, I'm getting ready to give the shir and I hear everybody's chatting outside in the waiting room. So there you go, it works perfectly for today's Mishnah. So today's Mishnah is attributed to Rabbi Yaakov. Now before we start, I do want to draw your attention to the fact that we already learned from Rabbi Yaakov, we learned something already in the previous chapter. So it is odd, because the Mishnah is very carefully constructed and very organized. So it is odd that Rabbi Yaakov would have been in the previous chapter and would have taught one teaching there, which was the teaching about the person who's traveling on the road and reviewing Torah, and then gets distracted by the beautiful landscape. Remember that Mishnah? Person who's busy learning Torah and then suddenly says, oh wow, look how beautiful that field is, or look how beautiful that tree is. So we say that person takes their life in their own hands. And then we have a whole lot of other Mishnayos for the rest of the previous chapter. And we have 15 Mishnayos in the beginning of this chapter. Now we're back to Rabbi Yaakov again. So you have to wonder, why didn't they just put it all together? Why are his teachings in two different prakim? So please God, we'll talk about that as well. So what does he teach us? He says, Ha'olam hazeh doime lifrois dor bifnei ha'olam haba. This world is compared to a prosdor, which is what? A corridor, a foyer, an antechamber, or a waiting room. Right? Bifnei ha'olam haba, ahead of the next world. And then he gives you practical advice. Haskein atzmacha biprosdor, prepare yourself in the foyer, prepare yourself in the antechamber, kedei shetikones the traklin, that you should be able to get into the traklin. What's a traklin? It's an unusual word, right? In fact, it's of Greek origin. Traklin. So you get two different interpretations. The most common interpretation is that a traklin is a palace. And the less common interpretation is that it's like a banquet hall. So let's talk about the banquet hall for a second, because it's something very relatable for us. What happens when you go to a simcha, let's say especially a wedding, you stand outside in the foyer, right? You stand outside in the foyer. What do you do in the foyer? So they come around and they pass around hors d'oeuvres and everybody chats and whatever the case is. But at the end of the day, everybody's waiting till they'll open the doors so that you can get into the banquet hall. So that's the imagery that he wants to share with us over here. The prosdor is a place where you bide your time waiting to get into the main act. So is this life a waiting room? We just spend some time over here in order to be able to get into the next, because when you get into the next room, that's where it really happens. By the way, the word traklin is related to a very interesting story in the Gemara. I'm not going to go through the whole story. The Gemara tells a story about when Rabbi Gamliel was temporarily or was suspended from his position as the head at the head of the yeshiva, and who took over from him, very famously, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who was 18 years old, and the next thing, he suddenly went white overnight. So remember that story? So in the course of that story, there's a moment where they say, Truku Gale. Hear the word? Traklin. It's like the word Truku Gale, which means lock the doors. Lock the doors because there were too many people coming to the yeshiva. They couldn't handle it. So lock the doors. So traklin is a place that is typically off limits. It's typically locked. And you have to wait until they open the doors for you. Okay, so that's the implication over here. So it could either be the palace or it could be the banquet hall. But either way you look at it, it sounds like Rabbi Yaakov is making our world seem like it's very transient and it's only the staging area for the next world. Somebody actually said to me that this world is just a rehearsal. This life is just a rehearsal for the next life. Which, I don't know, that might sound like a very spiritual principle, but does that mean there's no value in this life? It's just a rehearsal. So we have to understand, what is Rabbi Yaakov trying to teach us? And before we do that, let's try and make a list, because the different commentaries come up with a list of a whole lot of ways in which this world would be best compared to the foyer or the antechamber, and the next world would be compared to the banquet hall or the palace. So let's see, what things could we come up with, just in that metaphor of the difference between being in the foyer or the waiting room or the antechamber versus being in the actual place where the action happens. So let's try and connect it. Can you think of any correlations, any ways in which you could say our world is very much just like the foyer, just like the antechamber? Any thoughts? We're learning Torah here, yes.
So that can actually take us up there, and when we get up there, we'll be very happy to be, we will have rehearsed it down here.
So it is a rehearsal.
Right?
We're practicing.
Yes.
We're practicing here, and then in the next world, we'll get to do it for real. Right? That's what it sounds like, right? That's what it sounds like. What else?
What about that you can only do mitzvahs in this world?
Ooh, okay, now there's a big issue. There's a big issue. How can we call this world just the prep room, the rehearsal stage, the staging area, the antechamber? How can you use any of those expressions if at the end of the day you can only do mitzvahs in this world? So we'll come back to that next week, because Rabbi Yaakov has a two-stage teaching in Mishnah Tes Zayin and Mishnah Yud Zayin. So next week we'll come back to that in a lot of detail. I'm not saying we're not going to talk about it today, but we'll come back to it in a lot of detail next week. What else? So let's say you're going to a wedding, right? And you're standing there in the foyer. You're standing there in the foyer and you're waiting until that magical moment where they open the hall and you can actually go and you can sit down. So the assumption is that you'll spend less time in the foyer than you'll spend in the hall. Or you'd spend less time in the waiting room than you'd spend with the king in the palace. That's the expectation. So one of the reasons Rabbi Yaakov makes this comparison is because on an actual time scale, the amount of time we spend in this world is far less than the amount of time we'll spend in the next world. As seriously as we take this life, the reality is it's not very long. On the scale of history, it's not very long. So that would be the first reason why we'd compare it to a waiting room. Not necessarily to say it's of lesser value, but to say that it is less time. That would be the first explanation, or the first level of comparison between the metaphor and what it's supposed to represent. Now here's another thing. You know, when you're in the foyer, in the antechamber, so you go to a wedding. We'll stick with the wedding metaphor because it helps. So you go to a wedding and you stand there in the foyer. What happens is they probably have some drinks. They probably bring around some food. You might hear some music. They may even have a live quartet or something like that. You know, somebody playing music or whatever the case is. But you know that no matter how nice the foyer is, you know that when you get inside the hall, then it's going to be really special. That's where the decor will be. That's where you're going to have the proper meal. That's when you're going to have the full orchestra. So in a similar way, there's a sense that whatever you'll enjoy in this world is nothing compared to what you'll enjoy in the next world. That's another layer to what Rabbi Yaakov's telling us. Right now, this is just the foyer. That's just the introduction. It's very nice. And it can be very entertaining and very fulfilling, but compared to what's coming, right? That's the implication. Compared to what's coming, that's going to be even more enjoyable and even more fulfilling and even more meaningful. Nobody goes to a wedding in order to be in the foyer. Nobody goes to the palace in order to sit in the waiting room. If you go there, obviously the intention is you want to get to the main event. So in a similar vein, Rabbi Yaakov wants us to know nobody comes into this world just to live in this world. That's not to say there's no value in this world. But anybody who believes, you know, what do they say? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Which is effectively anybody who believes that the reason we come into this world is for this world, well, that would be quite misguided. There's always the truckling. There's the bigger picture that's going to follow. And yes, this is not, I don't think the word rehearsal is appropriate, because rehearsal makes it sound like this isn't the real deal and the next world will be the real deal. But rather it's where you exercise or practice or create the environment within which or through which you can get to experience what we really came into life for. Here's another interesting thing. Now, we don't really have this issue over here because of our climate and also because of space. You know, we're used to having a lot of space. But if you've been to simchas in other places in the world, very often they don't have the kind of space that we do, and they don't have the kind of climate that we do. So very often you're walking into the simcha and everybody's been in the rain or been in the snow, and everybody's dripping, and it can be a messy business. So the purpose of the foyer is that's where all the schmutz has to go. You know, you come in, that's where you clean your shoes, that's where you put down your umbrella, you hang up your coat. You know, we don't have this really in our country, but in overseas, the big deal in all the hotels is your coat check, right? Because you arrive with your coat and your scarf and whatever the case is. So the foyer is known to be a space where some of the schmutz of the world can get into the space and can dirty the space. I remember many years ago doing a wedding, and the wedding was in those days at Summer Place. And it was beautiful. It was supposed to be in the rose garden. It was magnificent, and then it poured. It absolutely poured. And at the last minute, they had to move the chuppah into the entrance hall of Summer Place, which is not designed for chuppahs. It's designed to be an entrance hall. And because it was pouring with rain, everybody trampled in with all their mud. So that's exactly what Rabbi Yaakov is talking about. That the prosdor, the antechamber, is a place where the schmutz of the world gets into the environment. Whereas by the time you get to the truckling, whether that be the palace or the hall, at that time you've already cleaned away all the schmutz, and now you can just enjoy the beauty of the environment. And that's a very telling reality about our lives. Doesn't matter how much good we do, doesn't matter how much we learn, doesn't matter how many mitzvahs we do. The reality of our physical experience of life is there is schmutz that gets dragged into the experience. Whereas the truckling, the next stage, the olam haba, the world that is to come, in that place we don't have these problems. It's a pristine environment and we don't have to worry, and we're not going to be sullied. This world, the Mefarshim and the commentators on the Mishnah say, is the Friday world, and that world is the Shabbos world. Now, we don't need any further explanation. We know exactly what the difference is between the Friday world and the Shabbos world. As the Gemara says, Mi shetorach be'erev Shabbos, yoichal be'Shabbos. Any person who works on Erev Shabbos will be able to eat on Shabbos. We had some kids at our house this Shabbos, and we said to them, okay, now we're going to bring out cholent. And they had never heard of this before. They'd never heard the word. They were like, how do you pronounce that? What is it? Cholent. And then we had to explain what it is. Explain what cholent is. Now, just to make things more interesting, as we well know, of course, in this country, cholent is not a guarantee. You know, please God, you should have cholent and power to keep the cholent going. You know, it's like a special miracle of Shabbos. So we were scheduled to have an outage, a load shedding outage from 12 o'clock in the afternoon, and there was a fault in the area, and the power went out at 10. At 10. Now, of course, you know how it works, right? If there's a fault in the area and you're scheduled for load shedding, no technician is going to come work on it till after that. Okay, you get the picture. So now these guys had never heard of cholent, and I had no idea what the cholent was going to be like, because there's nothing that is more distasteful than cold cholent. Sorry. Anyhow, Baruch Hashem, by some miracle, the cholent was actually still quite warm, and we were able to share it with them. Misha Torach Erev Shabbos, you put in the effort on Erev Shabbos on Friday, you get to eat the cholent on Shabbos. And so Rabbi Yaakov's telling us this is the Friday world, where it's quite chaotic, it's a little bit frenetic. I always joke with people, the last thing you want is your Friday night guests to arrive before you light candles. Because the human being who's there before candles and the human being who's there after candles, very different person. So you'd much rather be the host, who's there after the candles are already lit. Just don't come too early. So this is the Friday world. It's a time of chaos. It's a time of stress. It's a time of pressure. It's also a time of work. And the work that we do will provide the fruits of our labors in the next world. So that's what Rabbi Yaakov seems to be telling us. Now, of course, there's a burning question over here. And perhaps you've thought of this question. What would you say is the burning question that we need to define before we can go any further in this conversation? Because we've spoken generically so far. There's a prep area and there's the, so to speak, enjoyment area where you get to appreciate what you've created. What term or phrase or concept in this Mishnah needs desperately to be explained before we can go any further? No? See, this is it. We're all so comfortable with these concepts that we don't even think to ask. We have to ask ourselves the question, what is Olam Haba? Where is this next world? Because that's the pivot of this entire Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Ha'olam hazeh, we know where that is. We know where this world is. We don't have any issues there. You know how you know you're in this world? If there are things like potholes and power outages and poor politicians, then you know you're in this world. And if you think you're going to go somewhere else in this world, and that's going to be Olam Haba, that's a terrible mistake. Everybody thinks, no, if you travel, move to another country, that will be Olam Haba. So let's be clear. This is all Olam Hazeh. It doesn't matter where you go, it will always have its challenges and its problems. By the way, just an aside, quick punt for this country. The advantage of living in South Africa is that the issues of Olam Hazeh are issues that you can see. If you live in other places in the world, the issues of Olam Hazeh you don't necessarily see, and that's more dangerous. Subject for another conversation. All right, so where is Olam Haba? Or when is Olam Haba? Or what is Olam Haba? How would you translate it? Translation's not good, right? The world to come. Not a good translation. How would you define it? How would you understand the concept of Olam Haba? The world to come. It's what? You build it in this world, and then where or what is it? So you build it, it's spiritual, right? So that is the easiest way for us to explain it. Olam Hazeh is physical, tactile, tangible, corporeal, and Olam Haba is abstract, subtle, sublime, spiritual. Easiest way for us to distinguish. Yes? So is everybody satisfied with that explanation? Can we say Olam Haba is spiritual? I'm just asking. It's not a trick question. I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. So we're happy to say Olam Hazeh is physical. This world is physical. Olam Haba, the next world, is spiritual. Is it fair to say that?
This world is both.
I think this is a mixture.
Okay, this world is a hybrid. Yes. This world is a hybrid. Okay, so now we're talking. So this world is a hybrid of the spiritual and the physical. Now, which of the worlds is the one that Hashem is most interested in? The world that is a hybrid of physical and spiritual, or the world that is just spiritual?
I think this world is.
Okay, would you agree? So you're saying this world, and I would agree as well, but for the same reason that we all think this way, because we're biased. Because we would like this world to be valuable. We would like this world seriously, right? Because we don't want to think that this world is just a prose door. We don't want to think of this world as just a passageway. Like you're in transit. Like, ever sat in a transit lounge in an airport? That's not what this world is. And one day your plane's going to come in and then, you go to the next world. In fact, I think it's the Yochin, if I'm not mistaken, commentary on the Mishnah, who says one of the reasons he compares it to the antechamber of a palace is because when you're sitting in the antechamber of the palace, you don't know at which moment the king will summon you inside. And that's the message of this world. Nobody has a timeline and nobody has a guarantee how long it is till we get called into the next world. Okay, so by the time we get to the next Mishnah, please God, next week, we'll be able to truly visit this principle about which world is the one that Hashem, so to speak, prioritizes. But here's what's interesting. This notion of Olam Haba, the world to come. Remember, this is Pirkei Avos. And now it's the time of the year where we're learning Pirkei Avos on Shabbos afternoon. So before each chapter of Pirkei Avos, what do we say every Shabbos afternoon? Before each chapter of Pirkei Avos, what do we say? Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek la'olam haba. That every one of us has a portion in the world to come. So there we've got a definition, a working definition of olam haba. Now here's an interesting thing. Where is that quotation from? The one that we use to introduce the chapters every single week. That every one of us has a portion of the world to come. Where's it from? Anybody know? It's not from Pirkei Avos, right? It is not part of Pirkei Avos. It's an add-in from what? From Pirkei Chelek. Pirkei Chelek is the final chapter of the tractate Sanhedrin. And the reason it's called Pirkei Chelek is because it starts with these words. Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek. Every one of us has a portion of the world to come. So it gets nicknamed Pirkei Chelek, the chapter about the portion of the world to come. Now, you got to love the way Judaism operates. You got to love it, right? We always make a statement and then we qualify the statement. You ever noticed we do this a lot? So the Mishnah says, Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek la'olam haba. Every Jew has a portion of the world to come. And the Gemara immediately starts off by saying, Ve'elu she'ein lahem chelek la'olam haba. And the following people have no portion of the world to come. One second, you just said that everybody has a chelek. What do you mean? Now you're continuing to say, no, certain people don't. Okay? Subject for another conversation. But what's relevant to us is the first one on the list of somebody who has no portion in Olam Haba is a person who denies the belief in resurrection of the dead. Says Rashi, how would it make any sense for a person to benefit from something they believe cannot exist? In other words, what's Rashi telling us? Olam Haba is the time of the resurrection of the dead. How do you know that? Because look, the person who denies the possibility of the resurrection, that is the person who doesn't get Olam Haba. In other words, Olam Haba is after the resurrection. Now, is that a spiritual space? The resurrection of the dead, is that a spiritual space? Interesting, right? It's resurrection. That means coming back into the physical space. So that's fascinating. Now, to be fair, the term Olam Haba is used in certain conversations to refer to Gan Eden, the heavenly realm, which is completely spiritual, like the Rambam typically writes. And in other places, like this Mishnah, Olam Haba is used to refer to Techiyas HaMeis in the time of the resurrection. So it's not absolutely clear that we're saying our world is a physical world with spiritual experiences, which is a preparation for a spiritual world. It might actually be a preparation for a world where the spiritual and the physical are totally synthesized. So that's interesting. Now, one of the commentaries on the Mishnah is called the Derech Chaim, on this Mishnah, and it says something absolutely fascinating. Before we learn this Derech Chaim, I want to just tell you a story. Once there was an individual, a very wealthy individual who was traveling, and he heard that in the town of Mezrich, he was a follower of the Baal Shem Tov, and he heard that in the town of Mezrich there was this individual who was a chassid, a follower of the Baal Shem Tov, who subsequently succeeded the Baal Shem Tov. His name was Rabbi Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezrich. And he heard he's such a great scholar, he wanted to go and see him and engage with him. So he arrives in the town of Mezrich, and he says, where is the great scholar Rabbi Dov Ber? So they said to him, you mean the Maggid? He said, yeah. So they directed him to the edge of town. The edge of town was the poorest area in town. He didn't expect that. He thought, this great rabbi. Surely he's going to live in the middle of whatever the Glen Hazel of that time was, and he'd be in a nice home and supported by the community. And yeah, he's on the edge of town. He comes to his place, it's a real ramshackle hovel. He walks in. He sees he's got a few blocks of wood which alternated between chairs and tables, and there's straw for beds, and there's like the whole family on top of each other in one room. So he walks in. He was so out of his comfort zone. So he says to the Maggid HaMezrich, he says, where's your furniture? Where are your belongings? So the Maggid HaMezrich said to him, where's your furniture? Where are your belongings? He says, what do you mean? I'm just on the road. When I get home, I've got all my furniture and assets at home. He says, me too. So there is this concept about understanding that home is not in the physical space. It's just a prosdor. It's just an introductory space. Doesn't mean it has no value. So Derech Chaim says this, and it's a very fascinating insight. He says, it doesn't make any sense that Hashem, who is perfect, infinite, eternal, would create a reality that is imperfect and finite and within which everything dies. It doesn't make sense. Normally, the way of the world, and Hashem has designed the world always to give us insight into how things are in Hashem's reality. So in our world, you create, or any person who creates, always creates in a way that is similar to themselves. So the artist will express themselves in their art. The composer will express themselves in their music. The architect in the buildings that they construct, and so on and so forth. So you can always kind of identify the trademark of the particular individual. Oh, that's a Picasso, that's a Mozart, that's a Herbert Baker Home. You know, you can always identify the trademark of the individual in the things that they create because it reflects them. How then could it be that Hashem, who is infinite, eternal, and perfect, would create a world that is anything but? This doesn't seem to make sense. Must be, says the Derech Chaim, must be that the whole purpose is the world will reach a state of perfection and eternity. Must be. Because it's a world that Hashem created. So at some point it has to reflect Hashem's reality. Now, okay. So now the question is this. The big question. This is the $1 million question. It's even bigger than the question we had in the previous missions. Anybody remember what the previous Mishnah was? The previous Mishnah was that we have no insight into why it is that bad people succeed and good people suffer. So Rabbi Yaakov picks up on that theme and he says, well, there are many possible angles. One is, the world as we know it now is just a prosdor. Now you hear the difference. We're no longer saying our life is just a prosdor, it's just a prep area for the next life. As if to say our life has no value, but the next will have value, and perhaps will sow the seeds of value in this world. He's actually saying this entire world as we know it, the reality as we know it, is a prosdor, it's a temporary state. So if in this temporary state the wrong people are in power and the good people are suffering, that's because it's a temporary state. That's because Hashem created the world to be in a way that is imperfect, which brings us to this $1 million question. Why? So that we could, right? So because from Hashem's perspective, He could do anything, right? And He could have created a world right from the get-go that would have been a good world and a wholesome world and a healthy world and a world without pain and without distraction, without temptation, in fact, He could have just left it as Gan Eden right in the beginning. Remember Gan Eden? Sounds pretty attractive, right? Okay, unless you have an issue with being vegan. But outside of that, Gan Eden seemed like a very attractive place. Now, what happened in Gan Eden? Let's analyze the story of Gan Eden for one moment. Hashem creates an environment that is absolutely perfect and absolutely pristine. And then He puts into that environment human beings who in that environment can live eternally. That was the plan. How do we know that's the plan? Because Hashem warns them, if you eat from the tree of knowledge, then there will be death. Then people will die. That implies that up until that point, people were not going to die. And it was an environment where you have direct communication with Hashem, not like us, we're trying to work out, is this what Hashem expects, isn't it? It was direct. Hashem comes along, He tells you straight, hey, you stepped out of line. So what happened? What happened in Gan Eden? What went wrong in Gan Eden? Now you have to be so careful how you answer this question.
Could it be that the human being had, for that and wanted their own desire and will.
Okay, so let's say that is exactly what happened. That there was this temporary lapse where the humans at the time, which was only two of them, right, Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, those humans temporarily lapsed, so they lost that clarity or that sense of connection to Hashem, and instead of prioritizing what Hashem wanted, they chose to prioritize what they wanted, and as a result, everything went to pieces. Is that a good explanation? I think it's a good explanation. What's the big problem with that, or any other explanation we will ever give? Since we're not people stronger than God, doesn't make any sense, right? Hashem has a plan. Exactly. Did Hashem make a mistake? Hashem had a plan. What was the plan? So ostensibly the plan was that there would be Gan Eden. He had a plan. And then these humans arrive with their limited resources, and they could break and undo Hashem's plan. Does it make any sense? We're not talking about ESCOM over here. Does it make any sense that human beings could totally, radically wreck Hashem's plan? I mean, for heaven's sake, we're thousands of years down the line, and it's still not fixed. Make any sense?
No.
So what was the plan? That was his plan. Oh, so now the question goes the other way. If Hashem's plan was that we should be imperfect, and we should be fallible, and we should have finite lives until some point in the future, why did he make Gan Eden in the first place? Why didn't he just give us the world as we know it, and give us a job to one day create a Gan Eden?
To aspire to.
To give it to something to aspire to, right? So where else in Judaism do we have a similar theme? Where you're given the experience, then it's taken away, and then you've got to work to reclaim it. The Beis Hamikdash is an example. The giving of the Torah at the golden, and then followed by the golden calf. The famous story in the Gemara about how every child is taught the entire Torah as a fetus, and then it forgets it. This is the way Hashem created the world. He gives us the experience, then takes away the experience, so at least we know what it is that we're chasing. So the state that we're living in, where we are fallible, and the world is imperfect, and life is finite, is a temporary state. It's just a prose story. It's just a waiting room. Not to say waiting room that we should be passive and wait for things to happen. It's an environment of imperfection that Hashem designed for one reason only. For one reason only. To allow us the schus, the merit, to create that palace. Could Hashem do it on his own? Of course he could have. But then what's the point of creation? That's Rabbi Yaakov's message. Not, God forbid, to say for one moment that the truth is this life is unfortunately just a necessary step in the, getting to another place. As many people believe, as many people think, right? Many people think it's all about the next world. And I'm not talking only in the Jewish world, in various religious or spiritual disciplines, that's what people believe. We live here in order to get into the next world. The real value is in the next world. Rabbi Yaakov is saying it's not that way. This is the prose story. It's a temporary environment that Hashem created, a temporarily imperfect environment to invite us on board, to give us the opportunity to create the truckling, to create the palace. We're not waiting outside the doors for them to be opened. We're creating that palace that lies behind those doors.
And it's much
It's
more worthwhile and rewarding.
because we've done it.
Yes.
Correct. There's only value in something that we have done. That's why the Gemara uses the expression that a person roitze adam bekav sheloi mitisha kaben shel chaveroi. A person would much rather have 10% of the income that they had earned of their own efforts than 90 times more that somebody else gave them for free. That's human nature.
Palace is different.
Say that again, I'm sorry?
Are we saying everyone's palace?
Oh, everyone's palace is different. Okay, now that's an interesting question. Is every person's palace different? I don't think so. I don't think that's what he's saying. I think he's saying collaboratively we're creating this environment that we will all mutually benefit from, because at the end of the day we're all in this together. It's a team effort. We're not looking just to, get myself front row seats or the spiritual villa on the spiritual beach in the next world. We're collaboratively creating a space that will be mutually beneficial for all of us. And that's why there's certain mitzvahs that are only for some people, right? Men can only do certain, and women can only do certain. And a kohen can only do certain mitzvahs. Certain mitzvahs you can only do in Israel, and certain mitzvahs you can only do in certain historical periods. And other mitzvahs you never want to have to do, but they're mitzvahs nonetheless. So we kind of rely on other people going through those mitzvahs in order to facilitate our, collaborative team. Eden is a very graded, personalized experience. Whereas the world after Mashiach comes is a very shared, mutual experience. So that's quite an important thing to know. Okay, so what's Rabbi Yaakov telling us? Hashem designed the world that we should spend time in this so-called antechamber to give us the opportunity to contribute. And from that, we'll get into the traklin. And that's why he uses the word haskein. What's the word haskein? Haskein atzmecha biprozdor. What does haskein mean? Haskein doesn't mean that this is where you put on your makeup. You should have done that before you got to the party, right? You don't sit there in the foyer before the wedding. Haskein means that even if we haven't done everything that we should have, we shouldn't believe that we are a lost cause. Haskein comes from the word tikkun, that at any time we have the capacity to repair, to fix, to catch up, both for ourselves and for the world around us by the choices that we make now going forward. Now that explains to us also, or at least it links to why it is that Rabbi Yaakov's two teachings are split into two chapters. In chapter 3, Rabbi Yaakov was talking about the value of Torah learning, because in chapter 3, his Mishnah taught us, if a person is out on the road and they're learning Torah, and then they stop learning to admire the beauty around them, that such a person takes their life in their own hands. There he was talking about Torah learning.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's exactly what can happen. Never mind you're walking on the road, in your own life.
Exactly.
You can get distracted
Exactly.
by all the physical tracking.
Correct. As a person could in the foyer as well, right? A person's never been to the palace before, so they get so excited about the antechamber they forget about going to the king. But the message of chapter 3 is the message of the power and value of Torah learning. Chapter 4, the message of this Mishnah, and you'll see it even more clearly in the next Mishnah, there he focuses on the value of doing mitzvahs. How do we know this? Because he says, prepare in this world to get into the palace. Now in the next world, whether that refers to Gan Eden or whether that refers to after the Messianic era and the time of the resurrection, we will learn Torah. Souls in Gan Eden learn Torah. That's what they do. In the time of Mashiach, we will learn Torah, as the Rambam says. That the only preoccupation of the entire human population will only be to learn Torah, to know God. So what's the differentiator between our lives now and Olam Haba? The ability to do mitzvahs. That's what he's telling us. We have to prepare ourselves with mitzvahs in this world in order to be able to get into that palace. Because once we're in that palace, there's no more mitzvahs. Now, I know what you're thinking. What are you saying? When Mashiach comes, we're not going to do mitzvahs anymore? Of course we will. Just in case anybody thought you were off the hook and there'd be no Pesach when Mashiach comes. Right? We will still do mitzvahs when Mashiach comes. However, the nature of those mitzvahs will be totally different to the nature of the mitzvahs as we do them now. There won't be any struggle. And because the whole purpose of struggle is to give us that sense of value and achievement, that is taken from us. So when we come to the Messianic age, the mitzvahs that we do out of a sense of inspiration rather than out of a sense of challenge. The challenge, the tikkun, hasken, can only happen in this world. Now here's something really interesting. Every single thing in Torah is absolutely precise. Nothing is accidental or incidental. Nothing. If you're reading the Tanakh, every single letter, not only a letter, but even the sing-song that we attribute to the letter or to the word when we're laning, has a whole channel of depth and meaning to it. Every nuance, every letter, every pronunciation, etc. When you get into the Mishnah, While the Mishnah is not necessarily letter perfect like the Torah is, it is absolutely word perfect. And that's how we learn in the Gemara whole reams of information from a single word in the Mishnah and exactly how the Mishnah said something. And the order in which things are taught in both the Mishnah and the Gemara and the subsequent commentators, the Rishonim, is all very specifically chosen. So, if one of Rabbi Yaakov's statements, the one about Torah, is in chapter 3, and the other two of his statements, this Mishnah and the next Mishnah, which are about mitzvahs, are in chapter 4, there has to be a reason. And the reason lies in the distinction between what the numbers 3 and 4 represent in Judaism. Any guesses?
Yes.
Who knows 3?
3 are the fathers.
3 are the fathers and 4 are the mothers, right? Okay, so how does that help us? So there's a very interesting piece of Gemara that goes through the letters of the Hebrew alphabet and tells us what each letter represents conceptually. And it says, Gimel Dalet Gemoil Dalim. You can hear the connection in the words. Gimel Gemol, Gemol like Gemilus Chesed, means to share, to give, to sustain. And Dalet comes from the word Dal, which means somebody who's exceedingly poor or in a very lowly state. The number 3 is the number of resource and the ability to give. The number 4 is the number of lack and the need to receive.
So it's very masculine and feminine.
Oh, I didn't want to say that, even though 3 are the fathers and 4 are the mothers.
Yes.
So there is the masculine and feminine. So the masculine energy is the giving energy and the feminine energy is the receiving energy. The only reason I didn't want to say that, I didn't want to give the implication that Torah assigns dalus, which is a sense of poverty, to the feminine energy. Even though that is valid, but it's not easy for people to understand without a full explanation. So park it for now.
And there's that beautiful, when the Rambam writes that letter to the agents, he says, heed the discipline of your father,
Yes.
and do not forsake
Right.
the guidance of your mother,
Right.
which has got a lot of depth and can link all this.
Correct. The difference between the mother and the father, this week's parasha, is Shimo v'aviv tiro. Okay, we're not going to go there. Because of time, even though it's a fascinating subject. So I think we've come up with 3 other topics for other shiurim in the course of today. So Gimel, Dalet, 3 and 4, this is going to be very, very intriguing. So in spiritual terms, in all books of Kabbalah, we speak about the fact that there are 4 spiritual worlds. You familiar with this? 4 spiritual worlds. And we call those worlds Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. We're actually going to come across it later on in the 6th Perek, where we quote the pasuk, Kol hanikra b'shmi v'richvoidi b'rasiv yetzartiv af asisiv. So there's a verse in the Torah that illustrates it to these 4 worlds. Atzilus, Bria, and Yetzira are totally spiritual worlds, whereas the world of Asiya has a spiritual and a physical side. So it's the lowest of all the worlds, and of course that's where we live. Mitzvahs are all about asiya. The word asiya means action. Mitzvahs are all about action. In fact, the intention that a person has when they do a mitzvah is it's valuable, but it's relatively insignificant to the fact that you do the mitzvah. In other words, if a person had to sit and meditate from now for the next 120 years on the significance of a mezuzah and the protection and the energy of a mezuzah, they would get 0 mitzvahs. But if somebody puts up a mezuzah on their door because some crazy frum relative came over and drove them nuts that they have to put up a mezuzah, and they don't care for it, but they have the mezuzah on their door, they will have done the mitzvah. Because asiya, action, is very much what mitzvahs are all about. So therefore, the number 3 is the number that represents the spiritual realms, Atzilus, Bria, and Yetzira. Whereas the number 4 is where the spiritual extends into the physical space, where you enter the 4th world as well. When Rabbi Yaakov talks about Torah learning, which is very much in the spiritual realm, because Torah is a spiritual experience, it's a mind experience, it's outside of physical deed, it's what we do with the capacity, the higher capacities that we have, the capacity of intellect, and Torah can happen in Gan Eden as well. That belongs in the 3rd chapter, because that's the chapter that relates to spiritual messages. But when Rabbi Yaakov wants to talk about mitzvahs, that is placed in the 4th chapter to illustrate to us that the operational arena of mitzvahs is in the prosdor, is in the antechamber, in the physical environment that isn't yet in the trachlin, that isn't yet in that great, beautiful spiritual environment. Now, that's only half the story. The other half of the story Rabbi Yaakov tells us in the next Mishnah. And the next Mishnah is one of the most paradoxical Mishnahs that you'll ever learn, because at first glance it appears that Rabbi Yaakov totally self-contradicts in this Mishnah, and it comes back to the core question. So what is Hashem most interested in? This world or the next world? Is this just a train stop, or is this actually the focus of the whole of creation, which in Mitzvah Hashem we'll pick up next week?